Man of sorrows, the Lamb of God, by his own betrayed, the sin of man and wrath of God has been on Jesus laid. Silent as he stood accused, beaten, mocked, and scorned, bowing to the Father's will, he took a crown of thorns. And oh, that rugged cross, my salvation, where your love poured out over me. Now my soul cries out, hallelujah, praise and honor unto thee. Sent of heaven, God's own Son, to purchase and redeem and reconcile the very ones who nailed him to that tree. And oh, that rugged cross, my salvation, where your love poured out over me. Now my soul cries out, hallelujah, praise and honor unto thee. My debt is paid, it is paid in full by the precious blood that my Jesus spilled. Now the curse of sin has no hold on me. Whom the Son sets free, oh, is free indeed. Now my debt is paid, it is paid in full by the precious blood that my Jesus spilled. Now the curse of sin has no hold on me. Whom the Son sets free, oh, is free indeed. Oh, that rugged cross, my salvation, where your love poured out over me. Now my soul cries out, hallelujah, praise and honor unto thee. See, the stone is rolled away. Behold the empty tomb. Hallelujah, God be praised. He's risen from the grave. Oh, that rugged cross, my salvation, where your love poured out over me. Now my soul cries out, hallelujah, praise and honor unto thee. Praise and honor unto thee.
Good morning, church family, and welcome to another of our online Sundays. Now, you may notice that I'm not wearing my usual Sunday attire, and the reason for that is that I'm recording this on Casual Wednesday. The other reason is that I'm not preaching this morning. This morning's sermon has been preached by John Tucker. John is the principal of Carey Baptist College here in Auckland, and it is a sermon which reminds us of the presence of Jesus with us in all that we go through. When I heard it, it spoke to me, and I trust it will speak to you.
Kia ora koutou. Hi everyone. Welcome to our living room. What am I looking forward to the most after lockdown? I guess on Tuesday morning, when I think about what I'm looking forward to the most, it's running down to Castor Bay Beach early in the morning before the workday starts and plunging into the sea and swimming out to the pontoon. I'm really looking forward to swimming again after this lockdown period ends. I love the water, I love swimming, and so I've really missed being able to swim. That would be probably top of my list. Which brings me in a funny kind of a way to the message that I'd like to share with you this morning. It's been described in the media in a number of ways, but let me share with you 4 terms that I've come across in my reading. It's been described as a brewing storm, a surprising storm, an unimaginable storm, and the perfect storm. I'm referring, of course, to COVID-19. I came across an article this week by a guy called Mark Lipsitch. He's a professor of epidemiology at Harvard University. His article was entitled Navigating the COVID-19 Pandemic, and it starts with these words. Imagine you're in a small boat, far, far from shore. A surprise storm capsizes the boat and tosses you into the sea. You try to tame your panic, somehow find the boat's flimsy but still floating life raft and struggle onto it. You catch your breath, you look around and try to think what to do next. Thinking clearly is hard to do though, after a near drowning experience. I imagine for many of you, the last few weeks has felt like a storm of sorts, a violent storm, as we've watched our world be buffeted by the effects of COVID-19, our society here in Aotearoa, our economy, our work, our families. It's been a really, really surprising and unimaginable, but life-changing and world-changing storm. And in the midst of a storm, it is hard to think clearly. It is hard to navigate wisely. So what I'd like to do this morning is to reflect on what Jesus might want to say to us by looking at another storm, a storm that's described in the pages of Scripture in Matthew chapter 14. So you might want to turn in a Bible to Matthew chapter 14, and I'd like to read this account of a storm starting at verse 22. The words will also be on the screen. Matthew chapter 14, verse 22. Immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side, while he dismissed the crowd. Now, after he had dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. Later that night, he was there alone, and the boat was already a considerable distance from land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. Shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them, walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. "It's a ghost," they said, and they cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage, it is I. Don't be afraid." "Lord, if it's you," Peter replied, "tell me to come to you on the water." "Come," he said. Then Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water, and came towards Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, cried out, "Lord, save me!" Immediately, Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. "You of little faith," he said, "why did you doubt?" And when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down. Then those who were in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Surely you are the Son of God." Jesus has just fed over 5,000 men, women, and children in the wilderness with nothing except the disciples' 5 little loaves and 2 small fish. Pathetic, limited, paltry resources. Jesus has taken those and used them to feed over 5,000 people. It's a miraculous act of provision. And immediately, Matthew says, Jesus makes his disciples, or perhaps more literally, he forces his disciples, he compels his disciples to get into a boat and go ahead of him to the other side of the lake, the other side of the Sea of Galilee. He wants to see, I think, if the disciples have learned the lesson that he is able to provide for them. And sure enough, before long, a monstrous storm erupts. The disciples are in a boat 2 or 3 kilometers from shore, and the boat, Matthew says, is buffeted by the waves. The word translated buffeted is a really strong one. It means to be tortured, to be distressed. The disciples are in deep distress because they're out of their depth and they fear for their lives. Can you imagine how they felt? When I was about 8 or 9 years of age, I had an experience very much like this. My cousin Grant and I decided that we would try and row across Little Huia Bay on the Manukau Harbour. I remember getting into the little blue boat, little dinghy that my dad had built. I remember waving goodbye to my parents on the shore. Parents were a lot more relaxed in those days. And we started to row out into the middle of the bay. And as we set out, the sun was shining and our spirits were high, but before long, pretty quickly, the sky started to darken and the rain started to fall, and the wind started to howl and the waves started to crash. And we tried desperately, taking turns, to row with all our puny might across the bay. But we made no very limited progress as the wind picked up because we just simply didn't have the strength. The waves were crashing against the boat and we were really, really terrified. And at one point, in desperation, we stood up to swap turns rowing. And as I was standing, a wave hit the boat, knocked me off my balance, and I fell out of the boat, plunging into the raging, broiling sea, only to discover that it was waist deep. At low tide, it turns out, all of Huia Bay is no more than waist deep. I was perfectly safe. My fears were unfounded, as were the disciples. Their fears also were completely unfounded. Matthew says that shortly after dawn, after the disciples had been toiling at the oars for up to 9 hours, Jesus goes out to them. Verse 25, walking on the lake. Now, the Old Testament sometimes pictures God walking on the waves of the sea. So, for example, Psalm 77, verse 19 says, "Your path, O God, your path led through the sea, your way through the mighty waters, though your footprints were not seen." Or Job chapter 9, verse 8 says that he, God alone, stretches out the heavens and treads on the waves of the sea. This is really significant because in ancient Hebrew thought, the waves of the sea represented the powers of chaos and destruction. The sea itself was the domain of evil. It was the home of evil spirits. So this image of God striding over the waves of the sea speaks to his sovereignty, his power over the forces of evil, the forces of chaos, the forces of destruction, all the forces and powers of our world. But when Jesus strides across the Sea of Galilee towards his disciples in the middle of a dark night in a raging storm, they don't see their Lord, their God, exercising, demonstrating, proving his power over the forces of this storm. They see a ghost. They assume that Jesus is an evil spirit on the lake, coming to them to wreak havoc and chaos on them. And so they cry out in terror. They cry out in fear and anguish. because they don't recognize Jesus. The Son of God, who sent them into the storm and who is working in this storm and who is sovereign over the forces of the storm, has come to them and is standing with them, and they don't recognize it. Do you see the irony? I love the story about G.K. Chesterton. He was the reasonably well-known, prominent author and journalist who, as an adult, as a public figure, an adult, came to faith in Jesus. His conversion was very public, and one day he was standing on a street corner in London, and a journalist approached him and said, "Excuse me, are you G.K. Chesterton?" He said, "Yes." And the journalist said, "Do you mind if I ask you a question?" And Chesterton said, "No, not at all, certainly, fire away." And the journalist said, "If the risen Jesus were to suddenly appear at this very moment and be standing behind you, what would you do?" And Chesterton looked the journalist in the eye and said, "He is. He is. The risen Christ, who strides over the waves, who is sovereign over the powers of evil, the forces of evil, all the forces that wreak havoc and chaos and destruction and pain and suffering in our world. He is standing with you. He's with you in the storm." Now, of course, I realize it may not feel like it. When you think about COVID-19, this pandemic that has wreaked such havoc in our world, I mean, it may be right now that your business is going under because of COVID-19, because of this lockdown. It may be that your income has been slashed. You've lost your job. You might lose your house. Maybe this lockdown has strangled your ability to study and you feel as though your education is being compromised. Maybe this time of isolation and lockdown has plunged someone you know and love into deep depression. Maybe if you're honest, this pandemic, this once in 100-year experience is threatening to drown a cherished dream that you have been carrying in your heart. Well, the one who called you to himself and who continues to call you to himself, the one who sent you into the boat, the one who leads you as your Lord, as the Son of God, he says, "I am sovereign over the powers of this world, all the forces that wreak havoc and destruction, and I'm with you. You can trust me. I will take care of you." The disciples, unfortunately, they don't recognize Jesus. They don't see that it's him. They don't hear his words as being the words of the one who is leading and directing their lives. And so immediately Jesus says to them in verse 27, "Take courage, it is I. Don't be afraid." The words translated "take courage," it is I. The words for "it is I" are ego eimi. Literally, I am. This is the divine name that God claimed for himself when Moses said, "Who are you? What's your name?" He said, "I am." That's my name, Yahweh. I am who I am. And Isaiah, the prophet Isaiah, he used that name when he was speaking God's words of comfort to his people when they were going through a crisis. And this is what he says in Isaiah chapter 43, verse 1 to 3. "Do not fear," God says, "for I have redeemed you. I have summoned you by name. You are mine. When you pass through the waters, I will be with you. When you pass through the rivers, they will not sweep over you. For I am the Lord your God, the Holy One of Israel, your Saviour. Jesus is saying here in this storm, this miracle, by striding over the waves like this, he is saying, that's who I am. I am the Lord your God. I am the covenant-keeping God of Israel, the faithful, sovereign God over the universe. And I am with you. I will be with you. This promise is being fulfilled right now in this event. You can count on me. I will be with you. I will take care of you. And eventually, the penny drops. Matthew says in verse 28 that Peter gets it. He cries out, Lord, if it's you, tell me to come to you on the water. In other words, Peter's saying, I want to be with you. And Jesus says, come. Come. So Peter gets down out of the boat and starts walking towards Jesus on the rolling, crashing waves. But, Matthew says, when he saw the wind, he becomes afraid and begins to sink, and so cries out in fear, Lord, save me. And again, Matthew says, immediately, Jesus reaches out his hand and catches him and says, you of little faith, why did you doubt? Why did you doubt? The word that's translated doubt here means to be divided in your mind, to be in two minds. Matthew says that Peter, he's divided. His attention is divided between Jesus and the wind, between his Lord and the waves. His attention is divided. And so the problem for Peter is not that he doesn't recognize Jesus. The problem now for Peter is that he's not concentrating on Jesus. He's not focusing on Jesus. His attention has been distracted. It's been divided. I've been reading a brilliant little book by Andrew Purvis called The Resurrection of Ministry. And in the book, he refers to an old Greek tradition or proverb that the eyes are the windows of the soul. In other words, what we look at colours or affects, impacts our soul, our heart, our mind, and ultimately our faith. And so, as the tradition said, you need to guard your eyes. You need to be careful and intentional about where you look, about the direction in which you face, about what you choose to focus on, because that will shape your heart, your mind, ultimately your faith. Will we look to Jesus or will we look to the wind? Will we look and listen to his words of promise and comfort, or will we look to ourselves and our limited resources? Just over 20 years ago, I was a somewhat anxious and frustrated, restless young lawyer. I'd spent just a few years practicing law, just long enough to know that I didn't want to spend the rest of my life practicing law. And over the space of several weeks, maybe months, I felt Jesus calling to me, saying to me, come, I want you to study theology. I want you to go to Carey and study theology. And so I did for 3 years. And the first 2 years, if I'm honest, were terrible for me personally, inwardly. I was full of anxiety. I was troubled. I was convulsed by an uncertainty in my spirit. I was so conscious of my limitations, my weaknesses, my fears, that I thought to myself, could Jesus really be calling me to be a pastor? Really? I can hardly believe it. And I was so scared that I found myself effectively crying out in my heart, Jesus, if this is you, tell me to come to you on the water. Call me to yourself. I need you to be clear. Call me into this. And one day I was in chapel at Carey, and someone was reading the words of Jesus to Peter after the resurrection, when the risen Christ asks Peter 3 times, do you love me? Jesus says to him, do you love me? A 3rd time, do you love me? then feed my sheep. And I just knew in that moment. I don't know how, don't ask me how I knew, but I just knew in that moment, as I heard those words to Peter, the risen Jesus was saying to me, John, do you love me? Then feed my sheep. Teach my word. I want you to be a pastor. I'm calling you. Come. I imagine you've had moments like that maybe, where you have sensed Jesus, the risen Lord, calling to you, saying, come. He's been inviting you maybe in the midst of this crisis to come. Maybe this pandemic has exposed your need of him. It's exposed the limitations of your own resources, your own strength and wisdom and ingenuity. And he's saying, come, trust me, entrust to me your work, your mortgage, your family, your life. It's time to sign over control of your life to me. Come. Maybe this pandemic has stirred up for you serious, unsettling questions about the sovereignty of God. How can a good and loving and wise God allow such pain and evil and suffering in our world? He could stop a virus, couldn't he? So why doesn't he? Maybe Jesus is saying to you in the midst of this storm, I'm not going to answer all your questions, but you can still trust me. Because look at me. I'm standing here in this storm with you. I know what it's like to suffer. I stepped into your world. I've stepped onto the sea. I know what it's like to be plunged into the sea of grief. I know what it's like to lose my life. And because of my suffering on your behalf, there is a day coming when there will no longer be suffering, where there will no longer be tears. They will be wiped away. This world will be perfect, without evil, without suffering. So keep walking with me. Keep looking to me. Come. Keep trusting me. Maybe this pandemic, on a more positive note, is throwing up some exciting possibilities for us as a faith community. Opportunities to participate in God's compassionate concern and care for those who are going to suffer most as a result of this crisis. And Jesus is saying, I want you to enter into this. As this possibility, as this opportunity emerges, I'm saying to you, come, I want you to generously share what you have with others. Be generous. Participate in what I'm doing, and you will experience my power and my provision. Come. Maybe, though, you've heard the words come, and if you're honest, it feels as though today you're like the disciples. You're cowering in the boat in the middle of the storm. Well, look again at the story. Look at how it ends. It ends with Jesus and Peter climbing into the boat, and Matthew says, when they got into the boat, the wind died down. Jesus again demonstrates his sovereignty, his authority, his power over the forces of chaos and destruction, the forces of evil, all the powers and forces of this world. And as a result, the disciples worship him, saying, surely you are the Son of God. Do you see it? Do you see him? Do you see Jesus striding over the waves of the sea? Can you imagine that? And can you hear him? Can you hear Jesus calling through the roaring wind? He's saying, come, come. I am sovereign over all of creation, and I am here with you. You can trust me. And he's saying, if you want to be my disciple, it means obeying me, obeying my word. It means getting into the boat when I say go, and it means stepping onto the water when I say come. If you want to see more clearly who I am and what I can do, Jesus says, then come. Come to me. Trust me. Keep trusting me. Focus your eyes on me. And that's how you navigate a storm.